Hey, folks, welcome back to another Social Psych 203 lecture. In this episode, in this lecture, we are going to talk about the self. Me. No, just kidding. Just the self in general. And as you may have noticed from my last, you've never taken a class from me, you may notice I like the comics to start us off. So we're going to be talking about the self, and one of the things that we are going to discuss when we get to things like attitudes and attribution is things like self-perception. Okay. So I really like this one from Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal. Great comic series. I do recommend it. But without further ado, let's jump in. Okay, so what we're going to talk about in this episode is the self. Shocking, right? So what is the self and how is it divided? Okay, these are two important questions for the self. And when I talk about the self, I'm going to be pretty cognitively oriented. So what does memory say about how you think about who you are and how it's divided? But I will sprinkle in there some of the more cultural things. Cognitive organization. So this is really important for how the self is managed. So once you know who you are and what you do, then how is that all stored up in here, right? And then last, we are going to just briefly mention things like executive function as a function of the self. So what are your tools that you use to regulate yourself? Okay. So we're going to start with these questions. Who are you? And who am I? You know, you ask yourself that question frequently. You ask yourself, who are you and who am I? Very frequently. More frequently than you think. So we're going to start with William James. William James was one of the early American psychologists. And in 1890, he wrote a quick little, and by quick I mean it was very big, writing on the self. And he thought to himself, what are the aspects of the self? What things do I know about myself and then can like chunk out into various things? And he came up with 3. And he said, there's a spiritual self. Okay. Lots of people were religious at this time, and there was a lot of cross-pollination between religion, philosophy, and science. So he was like, okay, there's a spiritual self. That's fine. Then there's a material self. These are things that are concrete about me. So spiritual self, more about the soul. Material self, more about the body. And then this is the important one that we're going to talk about. The social self. The social self. This is extremely critical to who you are as a person, and then who you are as a person interacting with other people. Okay, so that's the social self. And that's what we're going to spend time talking about. How did he figure out these things? Well, he did it through a technique called introspection. Okay. And so this is where you think about all of the things that are associated with you. And it gets more complex with age. Kids know where they live, what they do, and what they look like. Adults can talk more about personality and spiritual features. There are cultural differences. So Westerners are more individualistic. The person is the important piece of the culture, as opposed to collectivistic cultures, where the group is the most important thing in the culture. And so Westerners will tend to list more internal features like traits, like I'm outgoing, I'm funny, I'm smart, etc. Whereas folks from Eastern cultures tend to describe relationships and situations. Okay, who are they a member? Who do they? Who are they a member of? Like, what groups are they members of, etc. What kind of relationships do they have with their mother, their father, their siblings, their significant others, that sort of thing. So we're going to take this idea from William James and we're going to latch on to the social self one, and we are going to just jump into the components. So what are those? Okay. Well, you have your individual self. These are all of the things that you hold in you. So those are your beliefs. Okay. And especially beliefs about your traits, abilities, preferences, tastes, talents, what sets you apart from others. Okay, so that's the individual self. The relational self is how you are in specific relationships. Okay, so it's yourself to various relationships that you have. You could be a friendly person to your coworkers, but a curmudgeon to strangers. Okay, you could be a hard ass at work and a doting father at home. These are all sorts of things. This is going to play now. Maybe copyrighted. We'll see. Maybe get copyright flagged. We'll see. But I'm going to go ahead and play it.
That was 10 years ago. People evolve. I mean, are you the same person in high school? Oh, hell no.
I think you're gonna enjoy this.
My girl Mischel. Bitch, you know it. She living the only way she know how to. Lord. Oh, girl, you got to get your ring on up in there. I'm hoping my fat ass can hustle me up a vodka Gatorade. For real. I'm a dog. You feel me, Michelle? Mm-hmm. For real. He a scrub. True that. I'm gonna get me my champagne and grape soda on.
So how's Columbia?
Great. I'm almost done with my dissertation. I'm getting a Ph.D. in behavioral psychology.
Hey!
Oh, I know. Whenever I'm around Lily, she just brings out that side of me.
That's a relational
There's a
self.
psychological term for the phenomenon.
Vertigo? No.
Actually, it's associated. See, the neural pathways that.
Oh, no, you did not just fall on my jam.
By the way, this is How I Met Your Mother. Okay. This is, it's a bastardization of what I just mentioned with relational self, and the video kind of cut out in the audio. I don't know exactly what she says. If you know, please leave it in the comments below. But it is a pretty good relational self example. And I really do enjoy How I Met Your Mother for social psych. And many of these come from my good friend, Dr. Molly Metz. And then the last kind of self that we'll talk about is the collective self. This is your identity as a member of groups. So I'm a man. These are my collective self. I'm a man. I am a nerd. I am a Dodgers fan. I'm sorry if that offends anyone. I am a Eureka College professor. That's part of my identity. That's part of my collective self. So in addition to those traits, relational collective selves include knowledge about duties, roles, and obligations in relation to those other people, okay? And so we can delve deeper into that. Don't know what... Oh, sorry. William James said it best. He said, "A man has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize him. As many different social selves as there are distinct groups about whose opinion he cares." That has got to be exhausting. But it's true. We have as many relational and collective selves that are a part of our identity. Okay? We're going to cast aside those collective selves and not incorporate them if we don't care about the opinion of the group that they're from. Okay? Any interaction that we have with people is going to instigate a relational self, how you act in front of other people, okay? What you do, how you think in front of other people, like Lily and that other woman. So moving on to origins of these knowledge. So this is, as much as I want to be cognitive, there's some that aren't very cognitive. It's just my experimental background. My background has to do with cognitive stuff, and so I'm going to be talking about a lot of these from that perspective. So introspection, for example. So how you get your self-knowledge. So where does this knowledge about yourself come from? Well, you think about it inward. You just think about things, and you're like, well, I guess I could have done that way, and I seem to get tired around a lot of people, being around a lot of people. Maybe I'm more introverted. Okay, that's introspection, self-thought, self-reflection, that sort of thing. Okay. One of the ways that this introspection comes around is, what are you thinking about? This is one of the best names in psychology, and it is pronounced, and I'm probably going to get it wrong, but I have been told how to pronounce it. Csikszentmihalyi. Csikszentmihalyi. Something like that. Csikszentmihalyi. He is a contemporary psychologist. He's still alive. And he asked people what they were thinking about. And right smack dab in the middle there is yourself, among other things. I don't know how well you can read this. You may have to like full screen it. But we have work is the most. No thoughts, which I don't believe. We have time and leisure, and let's say, chores. I'm looking at my second monitor over here. That's where it is. People, conversation, I think, general TV, food, project, the things that you do. Okay. I have a little bit of an introspection example. So close your eyes and imagine yourself in a group discussion. A man makes several sexist comments about the proper role of women in society. For example, he says women should do the cooking and keep the group entertained. My Marge. Think about how you feel. Now open your eyes. Would you say something? Or ignore it and wait to see how other people reacted? Now, this is just a thought experiment. You don't have to tell me in the comments. Or if you want to, you can leave in the comments below. As you probably guessed, this is a real study. Female participants were put into groups, randomly assigned to hear a few sexist comments or not, and whether they spoke up was the dependent variable. You can see on this chart here. Other women just had the situation explained to them and answered whether they would speak up or not. So this that was the predicted one. And whether or not they heard the actual comments, right? So you can see here, so Swim and Hires, 1999. Blue bar is say something. Red bar is wait and see. You can see that when they predicted, most of the female participants said that they would say something. But in actuality, the vast majority of them, more than half waited and saw, did the wait and see technique to respond. Okay. So most of the women did that, and then less than half said something. Okay. The take home here is that just because you think about it and you introspect on it doesn't mean it's going to be your behavior. We're not very good at accurately predicting our behavior. As I mentioned in the last video, we are exceptionally bad at thinking about a priori causal theories. That is, why do we do the things we do before we do them? We don't do that. We don't do that. The second kind of self-knowledge is reflected appraisals. And here is a mirror, because reflected appraisals is how we know ourselves by how others view us and behave towards us. Okay, so this is generated. This research has been generated by what are called symbolic interactionists, who are among the group that are sort of psychologists and sociologists, the enmeshment between the two. So throughout our lives, people will react subtly or directly to us, right? So if we have parents who praise us, a partner who makes light of our anxieties, teachers who push us to the limit, peers who laugh at our jokes, we may come to see ourselves as competent, neurotic, have potential, and a good sense of humor. Sounds like me. Anyways, it's important that we see ourselves as we think others see us, not actually how they do see us, because we can't get inside their head. So these are the reflections of that, right? Which is why the looking glass self/mirror is a good metaphor for this, because you are not actually how people see you in the mirror. You are how you see you in the mirror. Other people see you normally, which is so very strange when it comes to things like doing Snapchat or other sort of video conferencing or pictures. When I see my mirrored self, I'm like, yeah, he looks pretty good. But as long as I don't see any letters or anything like that anywhere else, otherwise it takes me out of the illusion. And why people prefer their mirror than their actual selves in pictures. That's why we dissect ourselves in pictures, because that's how people actually see us, as opposed to how we think and perceive people see us, which is the mirror, which is the reflection. Third way of self-knowledge is socialization. Those agents of socialization. So socialization is the process by which one learns how to be a good member of one's society or culture, and likely both. Okay, so it's a lifelong process of inheriting and disseminating norms, customs, and ideologies, providing an individual with the skills, habits, etc. necessary for participating in his or her own society. Okay, socialization is the means by which social and cultural continuity are attained. Okay, so who are these agents? Who are these agents? Family, peers, schools, religion, political systems, media, things like Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts of America. Okay, so many things are socialized. How helpful, how aggressive, how racist. But one example, which I'll probably be using quite frequently throughout this course, is gender, because it's quite a bit misunderstood. Okay, so how do we learn gender? Well, one of the ways is through toys. Toys. Look at boy toys. It's Mega Bloks. What's it do? Be arranged in literally infinite ways, then hooked to computer and remote controlled. Girl toys. It's a doll. What's it do? Be a doll. Subsequently, why are there so few girl engineers? That's one way gender is socialized. Clothes, the room, chore assignments. Reinforcement of emotions. Peers, things like cooties. Segregation on the playground. Boys and girls playing separately. Teasing, exclusion for gender atypical behavior. That's what girls do, Billy. Why are you such a girl? Polarization of behaviors. Okay. Social structures do this as well. Churches, schools, and scouts. Scouts' names. So, Girl Scouts, you're a brownie. Boy Scouts, you're an eagle. Okay, the badges, what you have to do the badges for, or what you have to do for the badges. Okay, camping trips are segregated. Schools, dress codes, especially dress codes that require girls to wear skirts. Okay, boy-girl lines or tables. Reinforcement or punishment of classroom behavior. The boys will be boys adage, which is garbage. Church or other religious institutions. Participations in services. Okay. Who gets to lead those services? And then in media, it just all of that, all those three things, parents, peers, and social structures. The media compounds all of that in TVs, magazines, books, commercials. So we not only learn gender, we learn about the importance of gender through socialization. Context is key. Okay. So one of the ways that context is important, we'll talk about an attribution, distinctiveness. How different is this from the rest? So a couple of examples of distinctiveness. How we learn about ourselves is how distinct we are to other things that are unique and salient, okay? So we have the tall guy in the lineup. We have the woman surrounded by creepy dudes. Looks bad. That's an ad for alcohol, I believe. Where's the alcohol? Not sure. And then that poor cat who is about to get maimed by dogs. Although that cat could probably take out 2 of those 3 dogs. Just saying. Okay. So that's distinctiveness. That's the 4th way of knowing about ourselves. The 5th way, culture and gender. Culture and gender. Of course, I'm going to talk a little bit more about culture than gender, but you'll see where I'm going with this. So the typical division is between Westerners and Easterners. Okay, Westerners tend to be more individualistic. Easterners tend to be more collectivistic. Okay, and so how do we know ourselves? Well, it depends on what our culture suggests. And so is it more independent and individualistic, where our self is represented by these traits? And yes, we have father, mother, and siblings and friends that are around us in some ways, but they all have their own traits that are separate from mine. Whereas collectivistically, it's what we know about ourselves is interdependent, right? So we have ourself, but then we have shared components with the relationships in our life. There's overlap. Okay, they're overlapping. So this is with mothers, fathers, siblings, significant others, coworkers. They're all part of a group, and they are part of yourself, so to speak. Okay, and where do these come from? Socialization. Socialization never ends. 5th way. 5th way? 6th way. Social comparison. So Leon Festinger, who we'll talk about again in a little bit more detail when we get to cognitive dissonance, also came up with social comparison. Look at these 2 fish. I think I'd want to be the fish on the right. Wouldn't you? Yeah, I'm smaller, but I got some rocks and I got a place to hide. It's not just a fishbowl, okay? Social comparison is literally comparing ourselves to other people, okay? I don't necessarily care about those people, but I do care how I compare to those people. It's a subtle difference, okay? It's a subtle difference. When do we compare ourselves? All the time. But importantly, when we are uncertain about our standing, okay? So where are we in this group? Where are we individualistically? How are we in relation to our goals? It's when we're uncertain that we do the most comparison, okay? With whom do we compare? Well, the people around us, our classmates, our coworkers, our friends, our family. But it all has to be done. It's all based on our goals. Okay? It's all based on our goals. Okay. And so if our goal is to be accurate, then the comparison target is the person who is most similar to us. So, if I'm going to be accurate about my intellectual ability, I'm not going to compare myself to Albert Einstein. That would be ridiculous. And if I was trying to compare myself on tennis and I wanted to be accurate, then there would be no reason to compare myself to Roger Federer or Serena Williams. That'd be just dumb. Okay? If we want to improve ourselves, then we look at people who we think are doing better than us. Upward comparison. We want to get better because we want to improve ourselves. So we compare ourselves to who we aspire to be, right? So whoever that is in your life, right? Whoever that is in your life. If the goal is to feel good, then we want to compare ourselves to somebody who's not doing so hot. We do a downward comparison. And so comparing ourselves to people who are worse off than us gives us a self-esteem boost. I'm not saying it's the greatest thing, nor am I saying is it empathetic. But it does help us with our self-esteem every now and then. I don't recommend doing this all the time. I really don't. It is antithetical to empathy whatsoever because you don't care about why they're below you. It's not great. It's not great. Okay. The last origin of self-knowledge, where we come to know ourselves, is self-perception. Looking at ourselves by just making guesses about what we do. Okay? We observe our own behavior. We observe our attitudes and attributes by observing our own behavior. So this guy drank a bunch of coffee. Then he decides to watch a soccer game. And then his heart starts beating. And he's like, oh my God, why is my heart beating this way? Why do I feel this way? Well, the correct attribution would be like, oh yeah, it's all the caffeine that I ingested. An incorrect attribution would be, well, this game is pretty intense. It is the World Cup final after all. I'm really excited about my team winning. That's a misattribution because really the heart stuff is probably from all the caffeine he ate. Okay? So that's one way that we perceive ourselves. We observe our own behavior to figure out why we feel the way that we feel. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to be accurate sometimes. We're going to be inaccurate other times. That all goes into self-perception, though. Because it's almost like we're perceiving ourselves outside of ourselves. Like you're a Doctor Strange astral projection form in the astral plane, and you're like, oh my God, what am I doing right there? What am I doing? Okay, that's probably why I'm doing that. So how is this organized? This is organized through what's called a self-schema. So schemas are cognitive structures containing beliefs and knowledge in a given domain that guides, but more importantly, organizes our information processing. Okay, so that's a very cognitive definition for a schema. It's an organizational structure is really what a schema is. And it's a conceptual organizational structure. There's no boxes inside your brain like file cabinet schema. This is myself. I'm going to open my file cabinet and can pull out a file of myself. That's not how a schema works. These are conceptual organizational structures. Okay. And so here is an example of a self-schema for myself. I'm a professor in the middle, and surrounding that are the traits of a professor, the people about a professor, the duties of a professor, and the places that professors work and go. Okay? So when this schema is activated, I process information that are most relevant to being an early career professor. Features include the traits, like I said: busy, studious, hardworking. None of those. People, who are my collaborators, who are my mentors, my students. Places, being on campus, being in my office, being at home. The duties that I have: research, teaching, which is primarily the biggest responsibility that I have in this self-schema, and then service. Okay? And self-schemas are either stable or malleable. Okay? So stable self-schemas are central aspects to my self-concept. Okay? Who I am as a person. Malleable self-schemas are what happens when I'm in a different situation. Okay? What changes? What can I replace out of this fancy smart art? What can I replace that the given situation needs me to replace? Do I put my professor hat on, or do I put my I don't have another hat. Do I put my dad hat on? There we go. I'm like, what other hat do I have? We'll talk about more about the self-reference effect in a little in a future video, but I do want to mention it because it has to do with our self-concept. What we know about ourselves is best remembered. Okay, so if we're talking about, if we have to remember certain words, the best way, or to remember anything, the best way to remember anything, this is a study strategy, is to try to link it to yourself, because we remember the things about ourselves most efficiently and the best, and for the longest periods of time. We don't have to think about them too much. They are us. And especially if they are things that we think about over and over and over and over again. Like, one of the biggest things that I'll always keep with me is that I'm a big fat nerd. I love various things about nerd culture, and I will talk about those things ad infinitum. That's a nerdy thing, just using Latin like that. I will talk about them endlessly. And if somebody's like, dude, you're a nerd, I'll be like, yeah, I am. I know that about myself. And I will never not forget that about myself. And then I'll be like, am I a nerd? I don't know if I'm a nerd. So the idea here is that, and this is lots and lots of memory research work where participants are given different words and whether or not things are changed structurally, phonemically, semantically, or related to the self. And you see that most people really do remember these words the best. Okay? So if you want to remember something, tie it to yourself. Self, self, self. Okay? And here's the graph of that. This is adapted from a Stan Klein article, I believe. And you can see that people remember more words on average. This is out of 10. You're like, they're only remembering like 1 or 2 words. This is out of 10, okay? With a delay. So you're not going to have... Also, it's a surprise memory test. So you're not going to remember things if you're not instructed to remember them. And so, but you can clearly see the pattern. Remembering things about yourself. Primo. All right, the last thing that I wanted to talk about in this video is executive function, as I said in the outline. This has to do with executive function. And I like talking about this one because it's bringing up an interesting topic about self-regulation. Okay, so anything, we could talk about anything with self as the prefix, self hyphen enter here. Your book chapters have a ton of different kinds of whatever. But what I want to talk about with this one is an interesting study. And you may be familiar with this study. This is the Mischel set of studies that on delayed gratification. Mischel and his colleagues did these at Stanford University in the 60s and 70s. What they did was they had children in a room by themselves, and they offered them a marshmallow on a plate. And they said, if you don't eat this marshmallow, and I come back in about 10 minutes, and you haven't eaten it, then you will get a second marshmallow. Okay, those are giant marshmallows, by the way. So as a 4 or 5-year-old, 2 marshmallows, that sounds like a really good deal, but then you also can't eat it while you're in the room by yourself. There's no peer pressure. There's no parental or adult pressure. You just have to sit there and look at the marshmallow. There are plenty of fun videos on minor replications of this research. Now, the interesting thing about delayed gratification is that, generally speaking, people can delay their gratification. Okay, especially if the reward for delaying is substantial. Okay. In some of the studies that Mischel did, he argued that when these kids grew up, they had better life outcomes. So they had better SAT scores, lower body mass index, okay, and higher incomes, etc. The interesting thing is in the last 5 to 10 years or so, this is actually becoming unraveled. Just because these kids could delay gratification on this doesn't mean they're going to have better life outcomes. It's a situation where correlation definitely does not equal causation, and the correlations then are confounded by lots and lots and lots of things as the child grows older. So I do want you to reflect on this one and say, wow, that's a really cool finding. The kids who could delay their gratification are better in life because they're not as impulsive. That sounds great, right? But again, counterintuitive findings and the bias of the researchers is pretty important here, okay? But is this a bad model to talk about how your self is regulated? No, because we can talk about self-regulation through what's called the strength model, which, according to the folks that described this, it's a limited resource, okay? And so self-control can fill up or empty depending on what you're doing. So one of the things, and I like this because I'm a big fan of humor, and one of the ways that self-control is studied is that people are put in a room and they're put in front of a computer and they're told, I'm going to show you a series of funny clips. You are not allowed to laugh at them. If you laugh, you will be excluded from the participant pool and you will get the minimum compensation. If you don't laugh, then you will get this added compensation. It's great. It's great. Another way that self-control is studied is by telling the person, please write me a story, but you may not use the letter E. What? The letter E is the most common letter in the English language. English starts with E. Sorry, you can't use E in this story. Good luck. See you later. Oh my God. It is amazing. And then they're asked, hey, do another task for me. Do another task for me immediately. They'll suck at that task. They'll suck at it because they have no more control. Okay, so if they have to hold their laughter in and then they have to do it again, they'll probably be unlikely to hold their laughter in. If they have to do the story without the E and then they have to do it again, they're less likely to be able to do it. And so what helps you regain self-control? Well, much like sobriety, when drinking and when consuming alcohol, time. Time. It's the only thing that replenishes the self-control leader. Okay. Can you strengthen it? Maybe. It depends. What are those interpersonal implications then for self-regulation? Well, if you participate in a depleting task before maybe an interracial encounter, it will lead to more awkwardness and less liking because of intergroup dynamics and that sort of thing. We'll talk about that later in the term. Self-regulation is implicated in things like domestic violence, forgiveness, accommodation, and social support. You have to have those resources in order to do social interactions. Otherwise, you might as well just rip off all your clothes and run down the street saying, "For science!" That's another Saturday morning breakfast cereal comic. Self-awareness is another big thing. And I want to pause for a second and tell you about self-awareness. I think these days, self-awareness is by far the most desirable trait I would love to see in anybody. Because the internet is so loud and so obnoxious, and so just exhausting. And it has to do with a lot of people just not exhibiting self-awareness. So self-awareness is the ability to think about yourself and to be aware of yourself, to just know what kind of person you are presenting. Okay? What are those attitudes, values, goals? Duvall and Wicklund came up with self-awareness theory. What are they going to influence? Self-awareness bridges the gap between what one is doing and what should be aspired to or done. So I have an example for you. Now, it's not from the best of sources, but I think it is a decent example, a more simplistic way of talking about self-awareness. So it's from Louis C.K., and if you're not familiar with Louis C.K., he's a comedian, an actor who basically fell from grace during the Me Too movement a couple of years ago because he did some really nasty things with female comics, without their consent. And so he is, and also he's not very apologetic about it. But before this, before all of this happened, he had a set where he talked about self-awareness. And it's really important. I'm going to paraphrase it. And so forgive my language here. He said, if you are with somebody and they say, "Hey, you're being an asshole right now," and you say, "I'm not an asshole," that's an asshole thing to say. That's a lack of self-awareness. So what would be the self-awareness in that situation? Well, if somebody goes, "Hey, you're being an asshole right now," you go, "Oh, I am? I'm sorry. Okay. Maybe I'll stop what I'm doing and I'll think about it. I'm sorry if I am being an asshole. I apologize. I'm just going to go." The irony here is that Louis C.K. talked about self-awareness so simplistically, and yet he had very little self-awareness of what he was doing that was so bad. It's amazing. Okay, the irony is truly astounding. If you want to, watch the actual set about self-awareness, just go to YouTube and type in Louis C.K. self-awareness, and it'll take you right to just that bit. Okay, it's just a YouTube video of that bit. Okay. Something's weird with my animations on this slide, so I'm just going to put them both up. The last thing that I want to talk about is it's actually not the last thing. It's the penultimate thing. Now that I'm looking at my slides, is ironic process theory. So this is Dan Wegner. I think I may have spelled that wrong. He came up with the idea that the more we try to control our thoughts, the worse we are at it. And I briefly mentioned this, but he kind of went through and discussed it a little bit more. So the idea is the more you try not to think of something, the more it enters your mind and distracts you from other things. So the way that he described it was the mental processes have monitors, operators, and then when the operator falls asleep at the job, you end up with a rebound effect. Right? So the monitor is the mental process that's on the lookout for signs of unwanted thoughts. The operator is the process that actively pushes any signs of the unwanted thought out of consciousness. And you get the rebound effect when the operator falls asleep on the job. So the monitor's like, no, wait, no, whoa. The operator's like, wait, what happened? So if you want to think about it, so if I tell you, don't think about a white bear, the monitor's like, all right, white bear, I got it. You don't want me to think about it. The operator's like, no white bears, no white bears, no white bears. Okay? So if I ask you to do that, and I say, don't think about white bears for 5 minutes, ring this bell when you think of a bear. Every 30 seconds or so, you'll hear a ding. Then I tell you, all right, take a breather for a sec. But during this breather, let me know when you think about a white bear. Bing, 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 bing. That's the rebound effect. Okay? When you're told, hey, don't worry about it, monitors, you're off the hook, operators like, then white bear all over the place. So how do you minimize it? Well, you got to minimize your distractions. You got to minimize your stress, and you got to minimize your time urgency. I know distractions and time urgencies are a little bit easier than stress itself to minimize. So minimize your distractions. And when you're studying, put your phone away. Don't do it in front of the TV. Close all your tabs or your browser window or something. Time urgency. Does it have to get done now? Or can it get done later? That's going to minimize your thinking about it. Okay. Stress, do your best to cope with the stress, that's for sure. Okay. And then disengage from effort control when cognitive strain is too hard. So when you're doing something heavy, if you just want to think about it, just think about it. Just do it. Just think about the white bears. If you're trying to solve the Tower of Hanoi, just think about the white bears while you're solving the Tower of Hanoi. It's fine. Okay. Now, the last thing for this video is ego depletion. So ego depletion comes from the Baumeister group down in Florida. They said ego depletion was the mental fatigue of ego strength. Okay, so initial acts of self-control shift people's motivations away from further restraint or impulse control and toward gratification. And then Mickey Inslick up in Canada has also talked about this. He is not a fan of the ego depletion work that he did because it's not replicating. If you want to know more about his thoughts on that one, you can find the 4 Beers, 2 Psychologists, or 2 Psychologists, 4 Beers podcast where Mickey Inslick and Yoel Imbar talk about psychology and science while drinking beers. 2 each. So if you want to know more about ego depletion and what Mickey Inslick thinks about it these days, you can do that. Okay. So, but in any case, what I do want to say is that if our executive control as an aspect of ourselves is a limited resource, then we're going to have issues when that resource gets depleted. And so that's all I want you to take from this, is that it's a limited resource and it will zap our self-control if it gets taken up by cognition or a behavioral task. Okay. Limited resource model says that because it's a limited resource, we won't be able to regulate afterwards. And so if you want to think about the interactions of the biopsychosocial model, well, the psychology is the ego that we're talking about here and the limited resource of self-control. Then what's the biology underneath that? Too much sugar in the prefrontal cortex. So if you have your prefrontal cortex working right here in the front of the brain, you have it working and it's consuming so much glucose that eventually you're going to run out of glucose unless you nom on some fruit or candy or something like that. You're gonna lose that glucose, and then so it's not as much information being transferred around in your prefrontal cortex. So that would be the biological underpinning of that. And that's really all I wanted to talk about with the self. There's quite a bit more. I mean, this is 2 chapters worth, but we really don't have the time in this course to talk about all of the things with the self. I usually spend about 2 lectures in a normal size semester long class. But in this case, I don't have the time. So this is all the self that we're going to talk about. We may talk about more aspects in the live stream. So stay tuned for that. Come up with your questions. Leave any comments you have down below. Thanks for watching this episode of Psych 203 Social Psychology at Eureka College. Bye.